I stood by the kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, gazing at the garden bathed in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. Everything in my life appeared perfect. An immaculately kept house, a successful career, a steady marriage. Yet beneath this polished surface, I felt an emptiness I couldn't explain. The laughter of my husband and his uncle broke my reverie. They were seated in the living room, their voices carrying through the slightly ajar door. I smiled to myself, trying to focus on the dinner I was preparing. Yet a single phrase sliced through the hum of conversation and struck me with unexpected force. "She's always been too good for you," his uncle teased, his tone light but deliberate. My husband's laugh followed, dismissive yet indulgent. "You're not the first to say that." A strange mixture of irritation and something more primal stirred within me. Too good for him? What did that even mean? The words lingered in the air, wrapping around me like an invisible thread. I tried to shake them off, focusing instead on the rhythmic chop of the knife against the cutting board. By the time dinner was served, I'd almost convinced myself that the comment was harmless. But as we sat down at the table, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that had settled over me. His uncle, charismatic and effortlessly confident, leaned back in his chair, his eyes catching mine as I placed a dish on the table. "You've truly outdone yourself," he said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. "Your cooking matches the rest of you, impeccable." I felt a faint blush creeping up my neck. My husband laughed, oblivious. "She's full of surprises," he quipped, reaching for his glass of wine. But there was something about the way his uncle held my gaze, steady, unflinching, as if daring me to react. For the briefest of moments, the room seemed to shrink and all I could feel was the heat of his attention. That night as I lay in bed beside my husband, my mind replayed the evening's events. His uncle's words, his gaze, the subtle charge in the air, it all felt like the beginning of something I wasn't prepared to face. I turned to my husband, his face serene in the dim light, and wondered if he had noticed anything at all. The morning after that dinner I found myself unusually restless. The mundane rhythm of my life felt heavier than usual, the same steps suddenly requiring more effort. I busied myself with cleaning, cooking and organizing, yet my thoughts repeatedly wandered back to the moment at the table, his gaze fixed on mine like a thread I couldn't untangle. By the afternoon, I had convinced myself it was nothing more than an overreaction. As I stepped into the living room, the sun streaming through the large windows, I found my husband and his uncle engrossed in conversation. My husband waved me over. "Come join us for a coffee," he said, smiling as he gestured toward the empty chair. His uncle nodded in agreement, his expression warm but unreadable. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the invitation before finally sitting down. The conversation was harmless enough. Work, family, the usual pleasantries, but I felt a subtle undercurrent in his uncle's tone, a quiet intensity that seemed meant just for me. When my husband excused himself to take a call, the atmosphere shifted. I pretended to focus on the steam rising from my cup, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You're not the type to sit still, are you?" His voice was casual, but the question carried a deeper implication. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "What makes you say that?" He leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just an observation. You seem restless." The words hit too close to home. I opened my mouth to respond but found myself at a loss. Instead I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "I suppose we all have our moments." His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before he spoke again. "If you ever need a break from all this," he gestured vaguely toward the house, "you should join me for a walk. Fresh air does wonders." The suggestion was innocent enough on the surface, but it felt loaded with unspoken meaning. I nodded, unsure of how else to respond, and quickly excused myself under the guise of checking on dinner. That evening my husband suggested we all have a glass of wine together after dinner. As I poured the wine, his uncle approached, reaching for the glass at the same time I did. Our hands brushed briefly, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I pulled back quickly, glancing at him, only to find him watching me with a quiet intensity. For the rest of the evening I found it impossible to concentrate. Every time I looked up he was there, his presence inescapable. The next day I woke early, deciding to take him up on his offer for a walk. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, one I justified as an attempt to clear my head. I told myself it was nothing more than an opportunity to get some fresh air and reset my thoughts. We met by the garden gate, the early morning light casting long shadows across the grass. He greeted me with an easy smile, his casual demeanor doing little to quell my nerves. As we walked, our conversation flowed easily, dipping into light-hearted topics and deeper musings. He had a way of drawing me out, of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. At one point we paused by a quiet pond, the water shimmering under the morning sun. He turned to me, his expression unusually serious. "I meant what I said yesterday," he began, his voice low. "You seem unfulfilled." I looked away, focusing on the ripples in the water. "That's a bold assumption," I said, my tone guarded. "Is it?" He pressed gently, stepping closer. "Or is it just something no one's had the courage to say before?" The tension between us crackled like static, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink. I felt his hand graze mine, the contact brief but charged. My heart raced, and before I could fully process what was happening, I found myself leaning in. The kiss was sudden, electric, and over far too quickly. We both pulled back, breathing heavily, the reality of what had just happened crashing down around us. I started, but the words wouldn't come. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine for something unspoken. Before either of us could say anything more, the sound of my husband calling from the house broke the moment. I stepped back, my chest tight with a mix of guilt and longing, and turned to head back toward the house. The days following the kiss felt like walking a tightrope stretched between two worlds. On the surface, everything seemed normal. My husband went about his routine, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, while I tried to maintain a semblance of control. But beneath the veneer of calm, my thoughts were consumed by that moment by the pond. I told myself it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. Yet every time I crossed paths with him, whether in the kitchen, the living room, or even the hallway, the tension between us was undeniable. It was as though the air itself carried a weight only we could feel. One evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, the silence was broken by my husband's suggestion. "We should all spend the weekend at the cabin," he announced, looking between me and his uncle. "It's been a while since we've had a proper family getaway." My heart sank at the thought. The cabin was secluded, miles away from any distractions. I couldn't imagine anything more torturous than being trapped in close quarters with both of them. Yet I forced a smile and nodded. "That sounds nice." His uncle, sitting across from me, met my eyes briefly. His expression was unreadable, but I caught the faintest flicker of something. Anticipation, perhaps? Whatever it was, it left me feeling exposed. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, but my nerves were frayed by the time we arrived. The place was just as I remembered, warm, rustic, and surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. My husband busied himself unpacking the car, leaving me and his uncle alone in the quiet living room. He broke the silence first, his voice low. "You don't seem particularly thrilled to be here." I glanced at him, wary. "Why would you say that?" He shrugged, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Just an observation. You've been distracted lately." I didn't respond, unsure of how to navigate the conversation. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The first night passed uneventfully, though sleep eluded me. The cabin, usually a place of comfort, felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The following morning my husband suggested a hike, but I declined, claiming I wasn't feeling well. He left with little protest, and within minutes the cabin was eerily quiet. I sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze, when his uncle appeared, his presence filling the room like a shadow. "You're not much for hiking, are you?" he asked, his tone teasing but gentle. "Not today," I replied, forcing a smile. "I needed some time to myself." He crossed the room, stopping just short of where I sat. Funny, I thought the same thing. The air between us grew heavy, the unspoken words hanging like a thread about to snap. He took a step closer and my pulse quickened. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, startled. "Regret what?" He held my gaze, his expression steady. "The kiss." The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. I wanted to lie, to tell him it meant nothing, but the truth was written all over my face. "No," I admitted, the word barely audible. His eyes searched mine, and in that moment I felt completely exposed. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. The simple gesture sent a shiver through me, and I knew we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Before either of us could speak, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. My husband's voice called out, cheerful and oblivious. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding, and turned away. The cabin seemed quieter that night, the kind of silence that amplified every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside. My husband had gone to bed early, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. The fire crackled softly, its warmth barely reaching me as I sat curled up on the couch, pretending to read. I could feel his presence without looking, his slow, deliberate movements as he paced the room, the occasional glance in my direction. Every nerve in my body was on edge, bracing for the inevitable. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. I lowered the book and met his gaze. "I guess not. You?" He shook his head, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Not tonight." The tension in the room was unbearable. I stood, the book slipping from my lap, and moved to the window, staring out into the inky darkness. I didn't hear him approach until he was standing just behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're restless," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. I turned to face him, my breath catching as I realized just how close we were. "And you seem to have a habit of pointing that out." He chuckled, low and quiet. "Because it's true. Isn't it?" I didn't answer. The words felt too dangerous, too revealing. Instead, I looked away, my eyes flickering to the firelight dancing on the walls. He reached out, his hand grazing mine, a light, almost accidental touch that sent a jolt through me. My eyes snapped back to his, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I should have walked away. I should have put an end to whatever this was before it went any further. But instead I stayed rooted to the spot, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You know this is wrong," I said finally, my voice trembling. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know. But that doesn't make it any less real." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hand cupping my face as his lips found mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and every bit as overwhelming as the first. But this time there was no hesitation, no pulling away. I leaned into him, my hands gripping the front of his shirt as the world around us seemed to fade away. It wasn't until I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs that I broke away, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "We can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, stepping back reluctantly. "I know." The sound of my husband's voice calling my name shattered whatever spell had been cast over us. I turned away, pressing a hand to my lips as if I could erase what had just happened. The next day the three of us went for a hike together, the atmosphere unbearably awkward. My husband chatted animatedly, oblivious to the tension that crackled between his uncle and me. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands felt like a betrayal, and yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. When we reached a clearing overlooking the valley, my husband pulled out his camera, insisting on capturing the moment. As he fiddled with the settings, his uncle leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the only one struggling with this." I didn't dare look at him, afraid of what my expression might reveal. Instead I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then maybe we both need to stop." He let out a quiet laugh, the sound tinged with bitterness. Easier said than done. That night, back at the cabin, I lay awake long after my husband had fallen asleep. The guilt and longing battled within me, each one threatening to consume me. I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and yet a part of me didn't want to. The cabin, once a place of peace and tranquility, had become a battleground, one I wasn't sure I could survive unscathed. The ride home from the cabin was excruciating. My husband drove, happily recounting the highlights of our weekend, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I sat in the passenger seat, nodding at his words, while his uncle sat silently in the back seat. I avoided looking at him in the mirror, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what he might see in me. The house felt different when we returned, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting for something to unfold. My husband immediately buried himself in work calls, leaving me and his uncle alone in the kitchen as I unpacked groceries. The tension was unbearable, the silence between us louder than any words could have been. "Are you going to pretend nothing happened?" His voice was low, steady, and cut through the air like a blade. I froze, my hand hovering over a jar of spices. What else am I supposed to do? I asked, not daring to meet his gaze. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You can be honest. With me at least. I turned to face him, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and longing. Honest about what? That I made a mistake? That I don't know what I'm doing anymore? His eyes softened, and for a moment I thought he might reach out to me. But instead he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth lodged in my throat like a stone. Instead I turned back to the groceries, my hands trembling as I worked. That evening I tried to distract myself with household tasks, anything to avoid thinking about the growing weight of my emotions. My husband, oblivious as ever, kissed me on the cheek before retreating to his office for another late-night call. The emptiness that followed his absence felt like a chasm I couldn't cross. I found myself wandering the house, my steps aimless until I reached the living room. He was there, sitting in the dim light of the lamp, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up when he saw me, his expression cautious but inviting. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my heart pounding as I moved to sit across from him. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until he broke it. "You're not happy, are you?" The question was gentle, but it struck me like a slap. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead I stared at the floor, my hands twisting in my lap. "It's not that simple," I finally managed. "Maybe it is," he said, leaning forward. "Maybe you've just convinced yourself it's not." His words echoed in my mind long after I left the room. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. My life, perfect on the surface, was crumbling beneath the weight of my own desires. The next day my husband left early for a work trip, leaving me and his uncle alone in the house. The silence was oppressive, each passing moment a reminder of the line we'd already crossed. I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible. Our paths crossed constantly, on the stairs, in the kitchen, in the garden. Each interaction felt like a spark waiting to ignite. By evening the tension reached its breaking point. I found him in the living room, staring out the window at the fading light. He turned when he heard me enter, his expression a mixture of frustration and longing. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice raw. "Pretend that I don't feel something for you." I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think this is easy for me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You think I don't feel the same?" The confession hung between us, the final barrier shattered. He crossed the room in a few swift steps, his hand brushing against mine as he searched my face for any sign of hesitation. This time when he kissed me there was no hesitation, no guilt. It was deliberate, consuming, and left me breathless. I clung to him, my thoughts drowned out by the rush of emotions I could no longer suppress. The day started like any other, mundane in its predictability. My husband was still away on his work trip, and I busied myself with household tasks, trying to fill the silence. The washing machine, which had been acting up for weeks, finally gave out entirely, leaving a small puddle of water on the laundry room floor. His uncle offered to fix it, as he always did with practical matters. I didn't object. It gave me an excuse to avoid calling a repairman and a reason to keep myself occupied, even if it meant awkwardly lingering in his presence. I watched from the doorway as he knelt in front of the machine, sleeves rolled up and tools scattered around him. His ease with the task was almost enviable, his movements confident and deliberate. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than the memories of our previous encounters that still lingered uncomfortably fresh in my mind. "I think I've found the problem," he said, glancing over his shoulder at me with a crooked smile. "This thing's been clogged for ages." As he worked, there was a moment of clumsiness that caught me off guard. He shifted to reach for a tool, and somehow the edge of his pants caught on a protruding screw. Before either of us could react, they slid down his hips, leaving him in nothing but a pair of fitted black boxers. For a moment there was only stunned silence. Then we both burst into laughter, the kind that came unbidden and left tears in your eyes. He hastily pulled his pants back up, his face red despite his usual composure. "Well, that's one way to lighten the mood," he said, still chuckling as he returned to the machine. As I handed him another tool, he looked up with an unexpectedly serious expression. The machine's almost fixed, but I need you to do one last thing. What's that? I asked, still amused by the earlier mishap. I need you to check the water coming out of the machine, he said, holding a small container under the open valve. Taste it, make sure it's clean. I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was joking. But his expression remained earnest, and I decided to humor him. Leaning in, I dipped a finger into the water and tasted it. To my relief, it was just water, clean, cold, and unremarkable. It's fine, I said, laughing softly as I stepped back. Is this part of the official repair process, or are you just making it up as you go? He grinned, a mischievous glint in his eyes. A little of both. The rest of the repair passed uneventfully, though the earlier moments lingered in my mind. They were ridiculous, almost absurd, but they brought a levity that had been missing for weeks. As he packed up his tools and left the laundry room, I found myself smiling despite everything. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the memory replayed itself in my mind. His pants falling down, the laughter we couldn't contain, the playful way he asked me to taste the water. It was all so harmless, yet it left me feeling strangely exposed. I couldn't help but wonder if the laughter had been a way to mask something deeper, something neither of us was ready to confront. What struck me most was how natural it felt, as though for a brief moment, we weren't tiptoeing around unspoken truths or dancing on the edge of an invisible line. It was just us, laughing at the absurdity of life, if only for a moment. Looking back, it's a story that might seem like nothing more than a funny family anecdote, something to laugh about over dinner. But in that moment, standing there with him, I felt a flush of embarrassment I couldn't entirely explain. It wasn't the kind of embarrassment that came from discomfort. It was something else, something deeper that left me questioning everything. The days after the laundry room incident felt surreal. My mind swung wildly between the laughter we'd shared and the tension that continued to coil between us. I replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every look, every gesture, as though searching for answers I couldn't admit I needed. My husband returned from his trip a few days later, bringing with him the usual energy of someone who loved his routines. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my week, and barely registered my vague answers. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled as I set the table for dinner, or how my gaze lingered a second too long on his uncle, who joined us with his usual calm demeanor. It was during dinner that my husband, in his usual oblivious way, asked his uncle about his plans. "You've been with us for a while now. Any plans to settle back in the city?" His uncle shrugged, swirling the wine in his glass. "I've been thinking about it. It might be time to move on." The words hit me harder than I expected. My chest tightened, though I struggled to maintain a neutral expression. I focused on cutting my food, pretending not to care, but my heart raced at the thought of him leaving. "That's a shame," my husband said, shaking his head. "You've been such a help around here. I don't know what we'd do without you." Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered downstairs. The house was dark, save for the faint glow coming from the living room. He was there, sitting by the fire, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, moving to stand by the window. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held 1,000 unsaid words. "You didn't tell him," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "About leaving?" He took a sip of his wine before answering. "I haven't decided yet." I turned to face him, my hands gripping the edge of the windowsill. "And what are you waiting for?" He met my gaze, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Maybe I'm waiting for a reason to stay." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I looked away, my chest tight with emotion I couldn't untangle. "You shouldn't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because this, whatever this is, it's not right." The words came out in a rush, and I hated how weak they sounded, how unconvincing. He stood, closing the distance between us in a few slow steps. "You don't believe that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not really." For a moment I thought I might break. The pull between us was unbearable, a gravitational force that refused to be ignored. But then I stepped back, putting space between us. "You should go," I said, my voice trembling. "For both our sakes." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression somber. "If that's what you want." But as he walked away, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room, I wasn't sure if I was relieved or devastated. The next morning he packed his bags. My husband, ever practical, helped him load the car, chatting amiably about work and family as though nothing had changed. I stayed inside, watching from the window, my heart heavy with the weight of what could never be. As he prepared to leave, he paused by the door, his gaze meeting mine one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, and then he was gone. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. My husband and I carried on as though nothing had happened, though a part of me felt hollow. I told myself I'd made the right decision, that I'd chosen stability over chaos, but the memories lingered. The laughter in the laundry room, the stolen moments by the fire, the kiss by the pond. They were all pieces of a story that would never be told, a secret I would carry with me forever. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder what might have been. If I'd made different choices, if I'd let myself fall. But life isn't about what. It's about the choices we make and the ones we don't. And so, I live with mine.